The gala at the waterfront hotel was a glittering sea of glass and silk, but Daniel Cross stayed in the shadows, where he felt safer. He always had. Victoria Hale had insisted he come, her exact words, "Stay in the back. Don't embarrass me." She never understood that he didn't embarrass easily. It was the world that embarrassed him. He adjusted the collar of his rented tuxedo, feeling the scratch of the stiff fabric against his neck, and tried to steady his hands. They were rough, scarred from years of climbing poles and rewiring industrial panels. He wasn't used to this environment, and neither, it seemed, was he. Daniel had just stepped behind a marble column, thinking he could blend into the hum of jazz and polite laughter, when she appeared. Margaret Sterling. She moved through the crowd with a quiet confidence that seemed to carve a path through the room. And for a moment, Daniel forgot the gala, the donors, and the soft clink of glasses. Her hands reached for his, not in a handshake, but with the certainty of someone reclaiming what had been lost. Her fingers were warm, steady, and for a second, the noise of the party, the music, the chatter, even the glasses fell away. "I've been looking for you for 28 years, she whispered. The words were simple, almost casual, but they carried the weight of decades. Daniel barely recognized the voice, yet every note seemed familiar, like an echo from the past he hadn't dared revisit. He looked down at his hands as her thumb brushed the pale scar on his wrist, the one that traced a question mark from a long-forgotten job gone wrong. Memories rose like smoke, faulty wiring, angry clients, nights spent staring at ceiling panels instead of ceilings, wondering if life had somehow passed him by. Victoria Hale's presence reminded him that this wasn't just another evening. It was her night. She moved with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to attention, smoothing the folds of her gown, checking her reflection in the mirror of the valet entrance. Daniel followed, quietly, like he always did, a step behind, a shadow among shadows. The ballroom smelled of expensive polish, perfume, and a faint hint of floral air freshener piped through the vents. A trio of musicians played soft jazz near the floor-to-ceiling windows, their music slipping into the rippling reflections of the city lights on Elliott Bay. Victoria's smile was bright, effortless, and perfectly rehearsed. She greeted donors, executives, and the city's elite with the kind of warmth Daniel had long ago stopped expecting from anyone. He observed from behind her shoulder, careful not to draw attention, wishing he could make his hands invisible, but they had a story of their own, calluses, scars, the faint imprint of a live wire accident from years ago. It was a story Victoria noticed immediately. "They look rough," she said quietly when she grabbed his wrist in the restroom, inspecting the marks as though reading a map. "Here, cover the worst of it," she added, producing a small tube. From her purse, Daniel stared at the beige smear, the faint camouflage over decades of honest work. "These are from work," he said, "and this is from success," she replied, nodding toward the glittering ballroom. He washed it off with perfunctory movements, feeling the swirl of water carry away something far heavier than pigment. The room shifted when Margaret Sterling walked in. Daniel felt it before he saw it, the almost imperceptible change in air. Pressure, the pause in the chatter, the subtle dip in the music. She didn't glance at Victoria, didn't acknowledge the gala or the donors, just walked straight to him, her eyes locked onto his, unflinching, piercing through the years like a blade cutting the hum of the present. Daniel could only stand there, frozen by recognition and disbelief, when she finally spoke. Her voice was calm but certain. "No, I don't have the wrong person," Victoria faltered. Her glass slipped in her hand, shattering near Daniel's polished shoes. The noise drew a few startled glances, but Margaret's attention never wavered. She reached for him, touched his hands, and squeezed once, just once, but it carried more weight than 1,000 words. The room continued its pretense of normalcy, but Daniel felt it. The world had shifted, silently, irrevocably. The gala faded into background noise as the memory of the first encounter with Margaret returned him as a teenager in the baseball bleachers of Rockford, Illinois, the sun cutting through rusted chain-link fences, the crack of a bat echoing across a field that now seemed both impossibly small and impossibly vast. He remembered the promise he had made that day, the one that had seemed foolish, impossible. and yet now returned to him with uncanny precision. She had remembered. She had never forgotten. Victoria tried to reclaim control, stepping forward, smoothing her dress, attempting to restore the illusion that she was the center of attention. But Daniel was no longer invisible. Something in him had shifted. He could feel it in his chest, a slow, insistent pulse of awareness, a recognition that the life he had been told to lead quiet, compliant, obedient was not the life he truly belonged to. Later, at home, the tension remained. Victoria lay rigid in the bed, her back turned, absorbed in her phone, while Daniel stared at the ceiling, replaying Margaret's face, her words, the certainty in her gaze. The past and present collided, unrelenting, leaving him awake in the small hours. The next morning, the city seemed the same, but he had changed. The streets of Seattle, the smell of fresh coffee from the corner cafe, the distant hum of ferries across the bay, they were all reminders that life was still moving, and he could move with it. By lunch, Daniel was at his local credit union, the same one he had visited for years. He learned that his mailing address had been changed 6 months ago, redirected to a P.O. box authorized by Victoria under a power of attorney he didn't remember signing. Panic and disbelief washed over him, but he held it at bay. There was a system, he realized, a quiet but deliberate manipulation, and he wasn't powerless, not anymore. That evening, he confronted Victoria about the missing retirement binder. She dismissed his concerns, her tone calm, almost amused, insisting everything was digital now, effortless, clean. But Daniel saw the cracks in her composure, small fissures in the facade she presented. She had underestimated him, as she always had. He had proof, he thought. He would find it. He would understand it. He would step out of the shadows he had been told to occupy for decades and reclaim a part of his life that had been quietly stolen. By the time Daniel went to bed, his resolve had hardened. He reviewed his steps, replayed his interactions, and planned his next moves carefully. Margaret Sterling had returned to his life, bringing clarity and fire. Victoria's control was no longer absolute, and for the first time in years, Daniel Cross felt the faint but unmistakable thrill of being in charge of his own story. Daniel woke before dawn, the Seattle skyline still shadowed in a pre-dawn haze. The alarm wasn't necessary, his mind was already spinning, tracing every detail of the gala, every subtle glance, every imperceptible shift in the air when Margaret Sterling had appeared. He dressed quickly, trading the rented tux for his worn jeans, Red Wing boots, and a simple button-down shirt, the uniform of someone used to solving problems with his hands. But this wasn't electrical panels or live wires. This was numbers, accounts, and the quiet but devastating manipulations of someone he had trusted for years. By mid-morning, he found himself back at the local diner where he had first met Margaret. Since the gala, the bell on the door jingled. Faintly, the smell of brewed coffee and fried eggs mixing with a faint scent of rain. Margaret sat in the same corner booth, her back to the window, hands wrapped around a chipped mug. She looked up as he approached, her expression calm, almost casual, but her eyes carried the same intensity as the night before. "You still drink black," she said, voice soft but direct. "I never stopped," Daniel replied, sliding into the booth. He felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease, the first small relief in weeks. "I've been back in town once before," she said, setting her mug down carefully. "Drove past your old field on Boylan Street. The chain-link fence is rusted, the grass patchy, but I could still see you at the plate in '95. Bottom of the 7th. 2 outs. You hit it right over the third baseman's head. Everyone stood up at once. I knew then you were steady, reliable, not like the others." Daniel's chest tightened. The memory hit him harder than he expected. The smell of cut grass, the taste of dust in his mouth, his father's voice from the stands before he got sick. The past was tangible, almost suffocating, but Margaret's presence made it a little lighter. "Somehow, I wrote," she said quietly. "After you moved, I called. I asked around. I never got anything back." He nodded. He had always wondered if she had forgotten or if the letters had been lost. "I know," he said. "I didn't ask how you knew. I was afraid of the answer." They talked for nearly an hour, recounting fragments of Rockford, old friends, and the changes that had swept the city since they were teenagers. Margaret never touched him, never flirted. She simply listened. And Daniel felt a clarity he hadn't known he needed. When they stood to leave, she slid a card across the table. "If you ever need to understand paperwork," she said, "call this number. It's not about money, it's about clarity." The card burned a hole in his pocket on the drive home. Victoria noticed it immediately. "Who's Margaret Sterling?" she asked, too casual, as if she had no idea. "Someone from my past," Daniel said, trying to mask the sudden adrenaline racing through him. Victoria smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. Funny how the past shows up right when the future's on the line. Daniel couldn't sleep that night. He thought about letters that never arrived, about the life he might have had, and the binder that had disappeared, the blue retirement folder, the one that had tracked decades of sweat and labor, was gone. Every quarter, for years, a thick envelope had appeared in the mailbox like clockwork. Now it was missing. Paperless, Victoria had said. Cleaner, less clutter. But Daniel knew better. The next morning, he stopped by the credit union during his lunch break. The teller knew him from high school, recognized him even with the years on his face. She typed for a moment, frowned, and looked up. "Your mailing address was changed about 6 months ago," she said, hesitating. "To a P.O. box in town." Daniel felt his stomach drop. "Who authorized that?" "Your wife." "Power of attorney," she said gently. Daniel's hands gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles whitened. He never signed anything giving Victoria that authority. Never. And yet, here it was, official, legal, undeniable. Every red light on the way back to his shop felt like a drumbeat, echoing in his chest. That evening, he asked Victoria directly about the missing binder. She didn't meet his eyes at first, then finally looked at him with faint irritation. "It's all digital now," she said, dismissive. "You don't need to worry." "I do need to worry," Daniel said. "I've always looked at it." Her eyes hardened for a fraction of a second, then softened, carefully rehearsed. "You're tired. You've been distracted since the gala. Let me handle this." The word handle struck him like a hammer. Handle, control, authority. All the years he'd followed her lead, quietly obeying, suddenly crystallized into something he couldn't ignore. He went to bed that night staring at the ceiling, reliving every moment from the gala, every fleeting glance, every lie hidden in plain sight. By the next day, he had begun to take action. First, the forensic accountant Margaret had recommended Richard Bloom was contacted. Daniel met him at a small diner, a legal pad between them and a lukewarm pot of coffee. Richard spoke plainly, explaining how accounts could be redirected, how paperless statements could be intercepted, and how control of information gave someone the ability to quietly manipulate outcomes without raising suspicion. "You're not crazy," Richard said, "and you're not alone." The words were bomb, but they also fueled a fire. Daniel realized that Victoria's control had been quiet, methodical, and almost invisible. She had underestimated him, assuming his compliance was permanent. He wasn't. Powerless, he could fight back, slowly, precisely, without losing his mind or his credibility. That weekend, Victoria hosted a donor brunch at their house. She didn't invite him, she informed him. "Stay upstairs," she said, arranging flowers with meticulous care, the kind of perfection that always irritated him more than it should. "We're discussing leadership initiatives." Daniel smiled inwardly. "Leadership," she said, at his own dining table. He waited, watched, listened. When the donors began to comment on the curated state of the house, Daniel felt something shift inside him. The small, quiet rage that had been smoldering for weeks flared into determination. He descended the stairs, boots heavy on the hardwood, jeans and shirt simple, deliberate. Victoria's reaction was immediate. Her eyes went wide, her composure cracking. Just for a fraction of a second. "Daniel," she hissed, teeth barely moving. What are you doing down here?" "I live here," he said simply, ignoring the undertone. A gray-haired donor smiled at his boots, approving. And Daniel knew something had changed. For the first time in years, he wasn't invisible. He belonged in this space not as a shadow, but as someone who mattered. Later, After the donors had gone, Victoria cornered him in the kitchen. Her voice shook, a mixture of anger and panic. "You embarrassed me," she said. "I've been embarrassed by you for years," Daniel replied, calm, unyielding. The words had weight. They carried the authority he had been reclaiming. Victoria flinched but didn't speak. Daniel went to the garage, retrieved an old box of baseball clippings, faded photos, and a cassette tape labeled in Margaret's handwriting, "Summer '95. He held it like a talisman, a reminder that the past was not lost, and neither was he. Daniel knew, in that moment, that his life was shifting. Margaret Sterling had returned, not with demands, not with instructions, but with clarity, with purpose. Victoria Hale's control was no longer absolute. He had proof, he had direction, and, most importantly, he had the courage to step into the light he had been denied for far too long. Daniel spent the next morning in the quiet hum of his garage, surrounded by tools and wires, but not a single fuse or breaker demanded his attention. Instead, his hands, steady from years of labor, fumbled over financial statements, old envelopes, and digital printouts from the email Margaret Sterling had helped him access. Every document was a breadcrumb, a clue, a whisper of how far Victoria Hale had gone to control not just their lives, but the flow of his hard-earned resources. The binder, the one that had chronicled decades of his labor in a neat sequence of quarterly statements and pension summaries, remained elusive. It was like chasing a ghost through folders, drawers, and filing cabinets that had been reorganized with precise cruelty. He could almost feel Victoria's presence behind him in every perfectly placed sheet, every label she had shifted, but he refused to be intimidated. He had Margaret's words ringing in his mind. "You're not alone. You're not crazy. You're just seeing clearly for the first time." By late morning, Daniel drove to a small public library near downtown Seattle, a place that smelled faintly of aged paper and stale coffee, to access old accounts and emails without Victoria tracking him. It felt strange, almost comical, to be a man in his 50s perched at a public computer with bifocals sliding down his nose, fingers striking keys like a clumsy pianist. But necessity overrode pride. He logged into an old email account from his union apprenticeship days, the same account Victoria hadn't thought to close. Notifications, confirmations, account changes all buried neatly in folders she had ignored or couldn't access. He printed each page at the library printer, the machine whining in protest at the flood of documents he produced. But each page was proof, tangible evidence of the deception he had suspected for weeks. Margaret had warned him that clarity came in pieces, and he now understood what she meant. Every email, every statement, every digital delivery confirmation painted a picture of deliberate redirection. Victoria had rerouted his accounts, changed addresses, and controlled access under the guise of convenience and paperless simplicity. It wasn't just negligence, it was strategy. She had been quietly orchestrating it all while Daniel thought life was proceeding normally. When he returned home that evening, the house was the same curated museum of Victoria's taste and control. She was arranging fresh flowers in a vase by the dining table, serene and precise, as if she hadn't just been manipulating every aspect of his financial life. Daniel watched her for a moment, weighing his next move. He couldn't confront her openly, not yet. Not until he had the facts, the evidence, and a plan. He had Margaret's advice, precision, patience, clarity, not confrontation, not theatrics. Instead, he retreated to the garage again. The box of old memories, baseball clippings, and cassette tapes lay open on the workbench. He picked up a faded photograph of himself and Margaret in the bleachers, sun glaring behind them, their younger selves, laughing without a care. He traced the image with his fingers and felt something stir, a mix of nostalgia, resolve, and a growing understanding that life had given him a second chance. This wasn't just about money or control anymore. It was about reclaiming his identity, his agency, and the dignity that Victoria had quietly eroded over decades. The next day, Daniel called Richard Bloom, the forensic accountant, again. They met at a diner off Eastlake Avenue, a place with vinyl booths and the faint smell of greasy breakfast. Richard leaned back, fingers steepled, his eyes scanning the papers Daniel had brought. "Victoria Hale is methodical," he said. "She's not careless, she's calculated. The way she's moved accounts, controlled communications, it's not just manipulation. It's meticulous planning. She's made sure it's subtle enough that most people would never notice until it's too late." Daniel nodded, absorbing every word. He had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud, validated and organized, gave him both clarity and direction. "So I need to start tracking everything," he said. "Every account, every statement, every change. Step by step, exactly," Richard replied. "And don't try to confront her without proof. She's smart. And she's fast. You need to be smarter." By evening, Daniel had set up a system, spreadsheets, logs, printouts, and a timeline of events. He created a dedicated email, one Victoria had no access to, and began storing scanned copies of every document he could find. The process was meticulous, frustrating, but necessary. Each step reinforced a sense of control that had been missing for decades. Meanwhile, Victoria's behavior began to shift subtly, though Daniel noticed it first. She smiled more tightly at him, her usual composure showing small fissures when he was near. At the donor brunch, she had commanded the room with her typical elegance. But Daniel now saw the cracks, the slight hesitation in her voice. The way she glanced at him when no one was watching. She was aware of the challenge emerging, even if she didn't yet know the full extent. One evening, Daniel found himself back at the diner where he had first met Margaret for coffee. The rain was soft outside, slicking the streets of Seattle into reflections of neon and streetlights. Margaret sat in the corner booth, as always, quiet, patient, and observant. Daniel spread out his notes, printed emails, and digital statements. Across the table, "You're methodical," Margaret said, studying him over the rim of her mug. "You've been tracking everything. Good. That's exactly what you need right now." "I'm trying," Daniel replied, rubbing his eyes. "It feels overwhelming. The control she's had, it's everywhere. I thought I knew our life, but everything's been rerouted, reshaped without me even realizing it. That's why I came back," she said, voice soft but firm. "You need someone to guide you through it, to see clearly, without the fog Victoria has put in place. You're not alone in this." Daniel nodded, a mix of gratitude and resolve surging through him. Margaret's presence reminded him that clarity was possible, that he could confront, uncover, and reclaim what was rightfully his, but it would require patience, precision, and courage. Returning home, Daniel implemented the next phase of his plan. He checked his accounts late at night, cross-referenced statements, and created backups in multiple formats. Every discrepancy, every rerouted notification, every piece of altered communication was logged, cataloged, and stored. He was building a fortress of evidence, step by painstaking step. Victoria would not be able to manipulate him again, not if he continued this careful strategy. But even as he methodically rebuilt his understanding of their finances, a tension simmered between them. Victoria's sharp words and controlled smiles began to irritate him less. No longer holding the power they once did, he observed her from across the dining table, watching the way she unconsciously checked her phone, how her eyes lingered on his notes, her composure slipping in the smallest, telling moments. She knew something had changed, but she didn't yet know what he knew. That night, Daniel fell asleep with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The binder might be gone, the accounts manipulated, and the past partially hidden, but he had tools, allies, and clarity. Margaret's guidance, combined with Richard Bloom's expertise, had given him a roadmap. Step by step, he would uncover every alteration, regain control, and reclaim the life Victoria had tried to quietly dominate. And this time, he would not be in the back. He would stand in the light, fully present, fully aware, and fully capable of defending what was his. The storm outside had picked up, rain hammering against the windows, winds rattling the frames. But Daniel felt a calm certainty, the kind that comes from knowing that, for the first time in decades, he was seeing clearly, and no amount of manipulation could take that away. The following morning, Seattle's streets were slick from overnight rain, reflecting the neon glow of early commuter lights. Daniel drove his truck slowly, aware that his mind was no longer focused on the hum of traffic, but on spreadsheets, emails, and the faint trail of deception Victoria Hale had left behind. The binder might be gone, but he had built a mental map of her movements, each document, every rerouted statement, each subtle lie. He was assembling the puzzle piece by piece. Back at his home office, he spread out the printouts from the library, carefully cross-referencing them with digital statements from his union retirement accounts. A pattern emerged quickly: beneficiary changes he had never authorized, automated payments redirected to accounts he didn't recognize, and recurring notifications that had silently disappeared. Victoria had masked her manipulations with small gestures of convenience. Paperless, it's cleaner, she had said, but the proof was there, undeniable. Like a faint pulse of reality cutting through the fog of her control, Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had suspected manipulation, but seeing it quantified, documented, and undeniable filled him with both anger and a strange sense of empowerment. The moment of recognition, the first time he understood the full scope of her orchestration, was sobering. Victoria had been playing a game he didn't even know existed. But now he had the rules. The tension in the house grew almost immediately. Victoria's eyes flicked toward him more often, subtle but perceptible shifts in her posture betraying concern. She tried to maintain her curated composure, arranging flowers in perfect alignment or adjusting curtains. But Daniel noticed the small cracks, the nervous tilt of her head, the slightly tighter smile, the way she lingered by the dining table. When she thought he wasn't watching, he was no longer invisible. He had stepped out from behind the shadow of her control, and she could feel it. Later that afternoon, he called Margaret Sterling. They met at a small cafe along the waterfront, the damp air heavy with the scent of coffee and the bay. Margaret slid into the booth across from him, her expression calm but purposeful. "You found the discrepancies," she said without preamble. "Yes," Daniel replied, voice tight with focus. "Every rerouted statement, every unauthorized change. Victoria's fingerprints are everywhere, but I need to be careful. One wrong move and she'll cover it all, make it vanish again." Margaret nodded. "That's why we do this methodically. You collect proof, document everything, and keep it outside her reach. Don't confront her yet. Let her make mistakes. They will come if you stay patient." Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing slightly. Margaret's confidence was contagious. Sometimes I feel like she's everywhere. Every step I take, she anticipates it. That's why you take steps she doesn't expect," Margaret replied. "Be invisible in ways she can't see, and visible in ways that matter. She's skilled at control, but she's not infallible. Everyone slips eventually." That night, Daniel returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. He reviewed his printouts again, cross-checked dates, emails, and transaction logs. Each discrepancy was cataloged meticulously. The house was quiet. Victoria in another room, absorbed in her own routines, unaware that he had built a quiet fortress of evidence. By morning, Daniel had identified a major anomaly, a series of retirement contributions that had been diverted into accounts he couldn't access. The total was substantial, enough to destabilize his long-term planning if he didn't act. He immediately contacted Richard Bloom, explaining the specifics. "Exactly what I expected," Richard said after reviewing the details. "She's been careful, but she underestimated how thorough you'd be. You're close to having everything you need." Daniel hung up, feeling the first genuine surge of triumph in weeks. Margaret had told him patience, clarity, and precision were the weapons he needed, and now he was wielding them. That evening, Victoria made a misstep. Daniel had left his laptop open on the dining table, a spreadsheet detailing every account, transaction, and discrepancy. She glanced at it, and her expression faltered, though she quickly masked it with a casual smile. "Working late?" she asked, voice calm but tinged with curiosity. "Yes," Daniel replied simply, not looking up. He knew she had noticed. He could see it in the way she tilted her head, in the faint twitch of her jaw. The subtle acknowledgement of his agency unnerved her. For the first time in years, Daniel realized he wasn't afraid of her anymore. He didn't need to hide in the shadows. He didn't need to cower behind rented tuxedos. hidden hands, or silent obedience. He had Margaret's guidance, Richard's expertise, and above all, his own resolve. The next day, Daniel arranged a meeting with Samuel Hart, the attorney Margaret had recommended. In Hart's office, a quiet, modest space filled with bookshelves and the faint smell of leather and paper. Daniel laid out the evidence systematically. Hart leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes scanning the documents. "Victoria Hale is meticulous," he said. "What you've documented is substantial, but it's also delicate. Any misstep could trigger a defensive response. You need to approach this strategically. The goal is clarity and recovery, not confrontation." Daniel nodded. The attorney's advice mirrored Margaret's: precision, patience, and control. This wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about reclaiming what had always been his, quietly, methodically, without giving Victoria the chance to react impulsively. Back home, Daniel began preparing a timeline, cataloging every transaction, every altered account, and every communication he had accessed. It was exhaustive work, but necessary. Every night, he added notes, cross-referenced with emails, and built a dossier so complete that even a careful manipulator like Victoria would struggle to deny it. Meanwhile, Victoria began to show subtle signs of irritation. She hovered in rooms, checking details unnecessarily, asking pointed questions about minor household matters, and making faint comments about Daniel's curiosity. He noticed these shifts, but remained calm, careful not to react emotionally. The power he had been reclaiming was quiet, deliberate, and it unnerved her. One evening, after another day of logging transactions and emails, Daniel found himself reflecting on the strange duality of his life. By day, he was a skilled tradesman, the quiet man who kept Seattle's electrical grid humming and safe. By night, he was an investigator, cataloging, cross-referencing, and slowly dismantling the invisible barriers Victoria had erected around him. He realized that for decades, he had been told to stay in the back, to defer, to obey. Now, he was learning the exact opposite, that control could be taken back, quietly but decisively. The tension reached a new level during dinner a few nights later. Victoria asked about his work, her questions sharper than usual, her tone carefully neutral, but laced with subtle challenge. Daniel answered calmly, confidently, intentionally giving nothing away. He had prepared for this. Each response was measured, precise, a small assertion of his regained autonomy. She noticed, and he could see it in the subtle flicker of frustration across her face. That night, Daniel stayed awake longer than usual, reviewing the day's notes. Every detail mattered, every slight discrepancy mattered, every subtle shift in Victoria's behavior mattered. He was methodical, deliberate, patient. Margaret's words echoed in his mind. "You're not alone. You're not crazy. You're just seeing clearly for the first time in decades." Daniel Cross felt fully present in his own life. He was no longer behind Victoria's carefully constructed shadows. He was visible, aware, and quietly in control. The storm outside, the patter of rain against the windows, and the hum of the city below were no longer intimidating. They were background, a quiet rhythm to the strategy he was building, step by deliberate step. Daniel woke to the muted glow of the Seattle morning, the soft hum of the city still wrapped in mist. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the pressing weight of obligation or silent compliance. His mind was focused, almost surgical, parsing through the details of the previous night's work. Every account change, every missing statement, every redirected email had been cataloged, logged, and double-checked. Victoria Hale had thought she had concealed everything, but Daniel's methodical approach, combined with Margaret Sterling's guidance, was unraveling her web of control. Thread by careful thread, he started the day in his home office, a small, cluttered space that had become his command center. Spreadsheets lined one side of the desk, printouts piled carefully on the other. He cross-referenced bank statements with emails and paperless confirmations, building an unbroken chain of evidence. The patterns were unmistakable. Monthly contributions diverted, beneficiary changes made without his consent, notifications redirected to a PO box under Victoria's control. Each finding strengthened his resolve and sharpened his focus. The tension between him and Victoria had been steadily building. Her eyes lingered on him longer than necessary. Subtle comments about minor household details were delivered with sharp precision, and small adjustments around the house seemed designed to test his reactions. She had begun to realize that he was no longer passive, that the quiet man she had long assumed compliant was quietly reclaiming his agency. But she didn't yet know the full extent of his investigation. By mid-morning, Daniel called Richard Bloom. They arranged to meet at a small cafe in Ballard. Rain streaked the windows, a persistent gray veil over the city, but the atmosphere inside was warm, the smell of coffee and pastries comforting. Daniel laid out the latest findings, detailing the missing contributions and the carefully redirected statements. Richard leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Victoria underestimated you," he said. "She assumed you'd stay in the background, quietly compliant. But you've approached this with the precision and patience she didn't anticipate. If you continue like this, you'll uncover everything she's tried to hide. I need to be careful," Daniel said, tension tight in his voice. "I can't let her know what I know yet. One wrong move and she'll cover it up again." "Exactly," Richard agreed. "Keep building your timeline. Document every change. Don't confront her without proof. She's meticulous, but not infallible." By the afternoon, Daniel returned home, armed with a reinforced sense of purpose. He spent hours cross-checking and printing every account statement, email confirmation, and discrepancy. Each page was labeled, dated, and cataloged. By the time he finished, he had created a comprehensive dossier, a physical and digital record of Victoria's manipulations. Victoria, ever observant, had started noticing his increased activity. She lingered near his office, casually inquiring about his work, her voice smooth but probing. Daniel responded carefully, revealing nothing, offering neutral answers while remaining fully aware of her subtle tests. Every glance, every tone, every carefully chosen word from her was cataloged mentally alongside his evidence. That evening, Daniel met Margaret Sterling again at their familiar diner. He spread out the latest printouts and spreadsheets across the table. The bell above the door jingled faintly as patrons came and went, but their corner booth felt insulated from the world. "You've made significant progress," Margaret said, voice calm but sharp. "You've mapped her actions, documented the discrepancies. Now it's about precision. You need to prepare for her reactions and anticipate them. She will notice the change in your behavior. That's when the cracks will widen." Daniel nodded, absorbing her guidance. "I feel like she's already noticing small things, gestures, comments. She's aware I'm no longer passive." "That's exactly what you want," Margaret replied. "Her confidence is based on control. Once she senses a loss of it, she'll make mistakes. Our job is to wait, watch, and document. Every misstep she makes is proof for the eventual confrontation." Returning home, Daniel felt a mixture of exhilaration and tension. He organized the dossier further, aligning printed statements with digital backups, ensuring nothing could be altered or erased without a trace. He labeled each item meticulously, creating a clear narrative of Victoria's manipulations. It was painstaking work, but each action reinforced a sense of control and purpose he hadn't felt in decades. The following morning, Victoria made an unusual move. She asked him to review minor household accounts, ostensibly to check balances and upcoming payments. Daniel noticed her tone carried a subtle test, an attempt to gauge his understanding or possibly redirect him. He approached it with calm precision, checking each detail carefully, ensuring the accuracy of every figure. He didn't reveal the depth of his investigation, but allowed small corrections and confirmations to slip in naturally. By evening, the atmosphere in the house had shifted. Victoria was more tense, her composure occasionally faltering when she thought he wasn't looking. Daniel, for the first time in decades, felt fully present in his own life. The fear, the quiet subservience, the constant need to stay in the back, all of it was gone. He had Margaret's guidance, Richard's expertise, and his own meticulous documentation. He had tools, strategy, and proof. Daniel spent the night reviewing the timeline of discrepancies, noting patterns in the diversion of contributions, the redirection of notifications, and the subtle manipulation of information. Each entry reinforced his understanding of Victoria's methods and, more importantly, his ability to counter them. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the city outside, the rhythmic sound of rain against the windows. He felt a calm, measured focus, a patience built from decades of labor, problem-solving, and endurance. As he prepared to leave the house the next morning for a meeting with Richard, Daniel paused by the living room window. He watched the streets of Seattle glisten in the early light, reflections of street lamps dancing in puddles. A sense of clarity had settled over him. He knew Victoria would continue to test him, to probe for weaknesses, but he was ready. Every move he made was calculated, deliberate, informed by evidence and insight. He was no longer in the shadows. He was ready to step into the light. Daniel woke before sunrise, the faint orange glow of the city filtering through the blinds. For once, he didn't feel the usual anxiety that accompanied another day in Victoria Hale's carefully orchestrated world. He had spent weeks building a meticulous record of her manipulations, emails, bank statements, account logs, digital notifications, all corroborated and cross-referenced. Each page, each printed line, was a small victory in reclaiming his agency. And now the time had come to take a controlled step toward confrontation. He didn't rush. Daniel had learned patience, and he knew that timing, precision, and clarity were essential. He brewed coffee, organized the files he would present, and rehearsed his approach mentally. Margaret Sterling's words echoed in his mind. Control the situation, not the confrontation. Let the evidence speak louder than emotion. Victoria entered the kitchen with her usual composed air, her morning routine precise and exact. She glanced at him, a faint question in her eyes, the subtle tension he had observed for weeks now evident in small gestures, a pause in her step, a flicker of awareness in her gaze. Daniel didn't react to the subtle provocation. He continued his routine, sipping coffee, reviewing the final sequence of printouts, and ensuring everything was in perfect order. Morning, she said, her tone carefully neutral. Big day at work? Yes, Daniel replied, calm and steady. I have some things I need to review. He placed the dossier on the table, neatly stacked and labeled, without adding commentary. His silence was deliberate, letting the presence of the evidence do the talking. Victoria's eyes flicked to the top sheet, her composed mask faltering for a fraction of a second before she resumed her habitual poise. That's a lot, she said softly, as if testing his reaction. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He allowed the pause to stretch, maintaining a calm presence that made her shift slightly in her chair. He had spent decades living in the shadows of her control, and now he understood the subtle power of measured patience. He was no longer reacting to her. She was reacting to him. I want clarity, Daniel said finally, voice steady, eyes meeting hers directly. I've reviewed our financial accounts, statements, and communications. There are discrepancies that need explanation. Victoria's composed demeanor tensed visibly. She leaned back slightly, a careful calculation in her posture, and replied, discrepancies? What do you mean? Her tone was deliberate, smooth, but Daniel could detect the faint tremor beneath the surface, the first sign that her control was slipping. I have documented evidence, he continued, spreading the printouts across the table. Unauthorized changes, redirected contributions, statements sent to addresses I didn't authorize. Each item is dated, logged, and verified. I need answers, Victoria. For a long moment, she said nothing. Her eyes scanned the documents, her jaw tight, hands hovering slightly over the edge of the table. Daniel remained calm, giving her space to process without adding pressure. He had learned that patience was a weapon more effective than anger or confrontation. Finally, Victoria spoke, her voice controlled but colder than usual. I handled things for simplicity. Paperless statements, consolidated accounts. I thought I was helping. Daniel's expression didn't change. Helping is one thing. Redirecting contributions, altering beneficiaries, controlling access without consent is manipulation. These are your actions, Victoria, and they have consequences. A subtle shiver ran through her composure. She leaned back, scanning the room as if seeking an escape route. But Daniel's presence anchored her. He had stepped out of the shadows, fully visible, fully in control. She couldn't intimidate him anymore, couldn't manipulate him into silent compliance. "You've been controlling me for decades," Daniel said softly but firmly. "I've documented every action, every alteration, every misdirection. This ends now." Victoria's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she looked almost vulnerable, a side Daniel had never seen. She exhaled sharply, regaining composure, and replied, "You think you can undo everything with a stack of papers?" "It's not about undoing," Daniel said. "It's about reclaiming what's mine and ensuring transparency going forward. I won't be in the back anymore. I won't be invisible." The psychological shift was palpable. Victoria, usually so confident, so composed, now seemed off balance, her carefully constructed facade showing cracks under Daniel's calm insistence. He had prepared for this moment with precision, every document verified, every discrepancy traced, every step deliberate. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make threats. The presence of evidence alone carried weight far greater than any argument. "You're persistent," she said finally, a mixture of admiration and irritation in her tone. "I never realized how thorough you could be." "I've been patient," Daniel replied. "I've been documenting, and I've been learning. Your control over me ends now. There's no room for manipulation, no room for silent compliance. This is my life, and I will manage it, clearly and deliberately." Victoria's shoulders stiffened. She glanced at the dossier again, then back at Daniel, and, for a long moment, said nothing. The tension was thick, almost tangible. It was the first real acknowledgement that she understood he had shifted, that the silent man she had long assumed compliant was now fully awake, fully aware, and fully capable of defending himself. Finally, she spoke, her tone measured. "So what now?" Daniel said, placing his hands on the table. Steady and calm, we established transparency. Everything moving forward is documented, verified, and accessible to both of us. No more rerouted statements, no more unilateral changes. We handle our lives together, or not at all, but the manipulation stops today. Victoria's eyes searched his face, searching for doubt, hesitation, weakness. There was none. Daniel had spent weeks preparing for this, building a fortress of evidence and patience, and the calm, unwavering presence he projected was stronger than anything she had tried to wield against him. For the first time, she seemed to see him as he truly was, not the silent, compliant figure she had assumed, but a man capable of meticulous thought, patient planning, and decisive action. Her carefully controlled world had been quietly dismantled, one document at a time, and she realized it. "I understand," she said finally, her voice softer, almost cautious. "I didn't realize." Daniel allowed a small nod, not in triumph but acknowledgement. "You don't need to realize anything beyond this point. The evidence speaks for itself. From here, we move forward with clarity, honesty, and mutual respect, or we move apart. But manipulation ends today." The tension in the room remained, but for the first time in decades, Daniel felt a shift not just in his surroundings, but within himself. He had stepped out of the back, out of the shadows, and reclaimed his autonomy. The confrontation wasn't about anger, it wasn't about revenge, it was about clarity, precision, and taking his life back. Victoria sat back, processing, her carefully crafted composure weakened, her mind recalibrating. Daniel watched her, calm and steady, knowing that the balance of power had shifted, subtly but undeniably. He wasn't in the shadows anymore. He was visible, he was aware, and he was in control. That night, Daniel went to bed with a sense of measured accomplishment. The city outside continued its constant hum, the rain a steady rhythm against the windows. He felt a calm focus, a patient confidence, and the quiet certainty that for the first time in decades, he was truly living his own life fully, clearly and deliberately. The days that followed were quieter than Daniel expected, but the tension was palpable. Victoria Hale moved through the house with measured caution, her usual precise rhythm slightly altered, her eyes flicking to him more often than before. She spoke carefully, avoiding topics that might reveal weakness, and her usual insistence on controlling small details had diminished, replaced with a subtle, almost cautious observation. Daniel had noticed immediately. His presence had changed the dynamic, and she was acutely aware of it. He spent the mornings reviewing every detail of their financial records, cross-referencing with Margaret Sterling and the forensic accountant Richard Bloom had recommended. Each piece of evidence fit neatly into the larger puzzle, exposing further subtle diversions and manipulations that Victoria had attempted over the years. A small pattern emerged. She had redirected modest contributions from his union retirement, diverted minor reimbursements, and created digital confusion that masked her actions behind the guise of efficiency. It was precise, meticulous, and audacious, but now it was entirely visible to Daniel. By midweek, he organized a second meeting with Richard Bloom in his Ballard office. The rain outside had slowed, leaving streets glistening and reflective. Much like Daniel's mind sharp, clear, and precise, Victoria was clever, Richard said, scanning the latest set of documents Daniel had brought. But she underestimated your methodical approach. The sequence of diversions, the pattern of digital manipulation, it's all documented, traceable, and undeniable. You now have complete clarity. Daniel nodded. I want to be absolutely certain before I take any further steps. She's aware. I'm no longer passive. She'll respond strategically if she senses aggression. I need her reactions, her moves, carefully documented. Richard leaned forward. You're thinking in layers. That's exactly right. Observe, anticipate, and only act with certainty. This isn't about confrontation alone, it's about reclaiming control, and you have the tools to do it. Returning home, Daniel implemented subtle changes that tested Victoria's reactions. He began accessing statements on his own, verifying transactions, and making inquiries that previously would have required her involvement. Each small action was observed carefully. She noticed, reacted subtly, and corrected minor inconsistencies, revealing further manipulations. Daniel cataloged every nuance, every gesture, every misstep she made. Each was a piece of undeniable evidence. The next evening, he took a deliberate step. Over dinner, he asked about a series of digital transfers that had quietly shifted over the past year. Victoria, initially calm, hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding with her usual practiced composure. Those transfers were routine, nothing unusual. Daniel didn't react emotionally. He placed the printed records before her, neatly aligned, clearly labeled. Routine, he asked, voice calm but firm. Explain these. Victoria, dates, amounts, destinations. Her eyes flicked across the pages, a slight tremor in her hand betraying the first crack in her armor. She swallowed, paused, and then spoke carefully. Administrative adjustments. I thought it simplified things. Daniel leaned back slightly, maintaining calm control. Adjustments without consent, without disclosure, are manipulation. You've taken steps that affect my life and our finances without my knowledge. I need total transparency going forward. No exceptions. Clear, verifiable, and mutual. The conversation, quiet yet precise, marked a turning point. Victoria's careful smile wavered, her eyes scanning his calm, measured expression. She was realizing that the quiet, patient man she had long assumed compliant was now fully awake, fully aware, and fully capable of enforcing boundaries. Later that night, Daniel worked quietly in the living room, reviewing further records. While Victoria retreated to the study, he could hear the faint clack of her laptop keys, the subtle tension in her movements. He realized that her previous dominance had been carefully orchestrated not through open conflict, but through subtle, persistent control. And now, for the first time, he could see it clearly. Every small maneuver, every diverted statement, every controlled interaction, all exposed. By the weekend, Daniel and Margaret Sterling met again. This time in Margaret's office near the waterfront. The conversation focused on consolidating the evidence and preparing a clear plan to formalize the resolution of Victoria's manipulations. You're past the observation phase, Margaret said, her tone measured. You have documentation, patterns, and clear proof. Now it's about establishing accountability. You don't need confrontation. You need clarity, resolution, and the recovery of control. Daniel nodded. I want to reclaim my life completely. No half measures, no ambiguity. But I also want to handle this with precision. She shouldn't feel attacked. She needs to see clarity and the consequences of her choices." "Exactly," Margaret replied. "It's a psychological approach as much as a financial one. Evidence is your ally, patience your weapon." She's already aware that she no longer controls the narrative. Use that awareness to maintain leverage and guide the resolution without escalation. Back home, Daniel began implementing practical steps. He set up alerts, verified all beneficiary designations, restored access to his accounts, and documented each step. Victoria observed, her composure occasionally wavering as she realized she no longer had unilateral control. He was meticulous, deliberate, and precise, a stark contrast to the quiet compliance she had previously expected. The next confrontation came naturally, without preamble. Victoria noticed discrepancies she had anticipated controlling. She asked, cautiously, about the restored access to certain accounts. Daniel responded calmly, presenting clear documentation and a logical, methodical explanation. Her usual smooth deflections faltered under the weight of evidence and his unwavering composure. "You've changed," she said finally, a mixture of surprise and reluctant acknowledgement in her voice. "I have," Daniel replied simply, "and I'm done being passive. I have control of my life, my finances, and my autonomy. We can interact transparently and mutually, or we can not. Manipulation ends here." The psychological shift was profound. Victoria's careful construction of control had been systematically dismantled, not through anger or confrontation, but through patience, precision, and deliberate action. Daniel's calm, unwavering approach forced her to respond within the boundaries he set, subtly but decisively shifting the balance of power. By Sunday evening, the house felt different. The air was no longer heavy with unspoken tension. Daniel had reclaimed agency. Victoria had acknowledged boundaries, and the foundation of their interactions had been recalibrated. He spent the evening reviewing records one final time, ensuring nothing remained hidden, nothing unaccounted for. Each verified document reinforced the clarity he had achieved, the control he had reclaimed, and the life he had quietly built for himself. Daniel paused at the window, watching the fading light reflect off the wet streets below. He thought about the decades of compliance, the small ways he had been pushed to the back, the silent rules he had been taught to obey. But now, he understood the true measure of control, patience, clarity, and precise action. He had taken the first full step into the life he deserved, visible and aware, and for the first time in decades, he felt fully present in his own reality. The following week felt like a quiet calm before a storm. Daniel woke with a sense of purpose that had been foreign for decades. Every step he took, every action he planned, was deliberate, measured, and precise. He had meticulously documented every manipulation, every diversion, and every redirected statement Victoria Hale had executed. Now it was time to bring the final pieces together, not with anger, but with clarity, authority, and unassailable evidence. He spent the morning reviewing the dossier one last time, ensuring every detail was accurate and traceable. Bank transfers, account updates, beneficiary changes, and emails all aligned in chronological order, clearly labeled. Margaret Sterling had advised him to prepare not only a legal strategy, but also a psychological approach, anticipating every reaction Victoria might have once confronted with proof. Victoria appeared in the kitchen, her presence cautious, her steps measured. The subtle tension between them was unmistakable. She had sensed the shift in control long before. Her usual composure, precise and deliberate, seemed slightly frayed at the edges, revealing a vulnerability Daniel had never observed. "Morning," she said, attempting casualness. "Busy day." "Yes," Daniel replied, calm and deliberate. "A busy day for clarity." He placed the dossier on the table, neat and aligned. Unlike previous confrontations, he did not linger or speak beyond necessity. The stack of evidence, carefully compiled, carried the weight of decades of manipulation. Victoria's eyes flicked to the top sheet, a subtle pause betraying her composure. "That's a lot," she said softly, a trace of unease in her voice. "It's everything." Daniel said simply, "Every diversion, every unauthorized change, every action that affected me without my knowledge, all documented, verified, and traceable. I need transparency, Victoria, not explanations, not apologies, transparency. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She leaned back, her hands folding carefully on her lap. For the first time, Daniel saw the calculation falter. She realized that her careful orchestration had been exposed and that Daniel, once silent and compliant, now held the power. You, collected. All this? She asked, voice tight. Over the years. Yes, Daniel replied, calm and unwavering. And now it's time to act on it. Not with anger, but with clarity. This ends today. For a long moment, Victoria remained silent. Scanning the documents, Daniel didn't speak. He let the evidence, precise and undeniable, do the work. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the city outside. The subtle shift in power was almost tangible. Finally, she spoke. Her tone measured, trying to regain control. And what exactly do you expect me to do? Transparency, Daniel said firmly. All accounts accessible. All statements verifiable. All changes documented and agreed upon. No unilateral decisions. No diversions. No manipulation. You've had control for decades, Victoria. I'm reclaiming mine. Her eyes narrowed, scanning his calm, measured demeanor. For the first time, she saw not compliance, not quiet submission, but precision, patience, and authority. The quiet man she had assumed could be directed and silenced was now fully awake, fully aware, and fully in control. You've changed, she said finally, a mixture of acknowledgement and reluctant admiration. I didn't anticipate this. I've been patient, Daniel said simply. I've documented everything, and I'm done standing in the back. You'll either cooperate with clarity and transparency, or the next steps will be formalized, legally. But the manipulation stops today. Victoria's jaw tightened, and she nodded slightly. The first small concession to the shift in power. Daniel allowed himself a brief, measured sense of satisfaction. This wasn't triumph born of anger, it was the quiet authority of a life reclaimed. Carefully and deliberately, the rest of the week unfolded with careful adjustments. Victoria complied with account access, minor explanations, and clarifications. Each step was logged, documented, and verified by Daniel. He had shifted from passive compliance to active control, and Victoria was learning, slowly, that she no longer dictated the narrative. By midweek, Daniel implemented a final safeguard: secure, verifiable, and transparent monitoring of all accounts. Notifications were directed to him, statements confirmed, and each action documented meticulously. Victoria's reactions, once subtle and controlling, were now guided by his measured authority. Every attempt to assert unilateral influence was met with calm, precise documentation. Daniel spent the evenings reflecting on the past decades, the small humiliations, the silent compliance, the quiet backseat presence, all contrasted sharply with the clarity and control he now exercised. He realized that the life he had reclaimed wasn't just about finances or documentation. It was about agency, autonomy, and the freedom to exist visibly and fully in his own life. That Friday evening, he met Margaret Sterling one final time. The city outside was washed in soft twilight, the rain having left streets reflective and quiet. You've done it, Margaret said, her tone approving. You've reclaimed control, established clarity, and maintained precision throughout. Now it's about sustaining it. Victoria has acknowledged boundaries. You've demonstrated authority without conflict. That's the lasting victory. Daniel nodded. I've learned more than I imagined about patience, precision, and the subtle power of observation. I won't go back to silence. I won't allow manipulation to define my life again. Margaret smiled slightly. You've built a framework for a life fully your own. Not reactive, not defensive, but active. Deliberate and aware. That's rare. That's strength. Returning home, Daniel felt the final weight lift from his chest. Victoria moved through the house with her careful composure, but her subtle tension was now guided by his authority. He was no longer in the back. He was fully visible, fully present, and fully himself. That night, Daniel sat by the window, the city lights shimmering across the water. He reflected on the journey, the small humiliations, the subtle control, the decades of passive compliance and the patient, deliberate steps he had taken to reclaim his life. He realized that the confrontation, the documentation, and the final assertion of authority had not been about defeating Victoria, but about restoring himself. The city outside continued its constant hum, the rain beginning again in a soft patter. Daniel's hands rested calmly on the desk, the dossier complete and secure. He felt a quiet confidence, a deep, measured satisfaction. For the first time in decades, he was free not from others, but from the subtle, pervasive control that had defined so many years of his life. In the quiet of the night, Daniel understood a profound truth. Clarity, patience, and precision were more powerful than anger, more enduring than confrontation, and far more transformative than silent compliance. He had stepped fully into his life, and the shadow that had long held him back had been lifted. As the first rain of the new night tapped the windows, Daniel smiled faintly, a calm, deliberate acknowledgement of his own strength. The journey had been long, methodical, and deliberate, but finally, the life that had been quietly waiting, patiently observing, was fully his to live. Morning arrived with soft sunlight spilling through the blinds, warm and calm, a quiet contrast to the tension Daniel had carried for decades. For the first time in years, he felt unhurried. The city outside moved at its usual frenetic pace, but inside the apartment, there was a gentle clarity, a space finally his to occupy fully. The subtle control that had once defined his interactions with Victoria Hale was gone, replaced by mutual boundaries, transparency, and an unspoken acknowledgement of what had been and what would no longer define him. He sat at the kitchen table, with a cup of coffee, glancing at the neat stack of printouts he had meticulously organized. They were evidence of the past, but also a symbol of agency, a record of the patience, methodical planning, and deliberate action that had brought him here. He had spent months building this dossier, not for confrontation alone, but as a testament to clarity and control. Now it was complete, secure, and fully in his hands. Victoria moved into the kitchen quietly, her presence no longer imposing, but measured, controlled by awareness rather than dominance. She poured herself a cup of tea, avoiding direct eye contact at first. Daniel's gaze met hers calmly, deliberately. "Morning," she said, soft, almost tentative. "Morning." He replied, no tension, no veiled challenges, just clarity. She finally looked at him, eyes searching for a sign of anger or lingering resentment. Daniel's calm presence, precise and unwavering, answered silently. There was none, only the quiet assertion of boundaries and the reclaiming of his own life. "I've noticed your diligence," Victoria said carefully. "Everything's accounted for." The access, the statements, her voice trailed, almost a whisper. Daniel nodded. "It's all verified. I have clarity now. I have my life back. That's all that matters." For a long moment, they stood in quiet recognition of what had changed. She had tried to control decades of his life through subtle manipulation, and for decades, he had complied, unaware of the cumulative effects. But now, the balance had shifted. He was no longer passive. He was aware, visible, and fully capable of guiding the boundaries of his life. "I understand," she said finally, a faint acknowledgement of the shift. "You've been thorough, precise, patient, and I can't undo that." "No," Daniel said, calm and firm. "You can't. But we don't need to undo the past. We move forward with transparency, respect, and clarity. That's all I need." Victoria nodded slowly, the faint tension in her shoulders easing. She had acknowledged the boundaries, the evidence, and his autonomy. The subtle psychological control she had wielded for decades was neutralized not through confrontation, not through anger, but through patient, deliberate, and meticulous assertion of agency. That afternoon, Daniel took a long walk along the waterfront. The river mirrored the sunlight, shimmering and constant, a quiet rhythm like the life he had patiently reclaimed. He reflected on the decades of quiet compliance, small humiliations, and subtle control. The backseat presence he had once assumed was now gone. He moved visibly, deliberately, fully aware of his own autonomy. He thought about Eleanor Price, whose chance re-entry into his life had reminded him of his own worth. of the life he had almost ignored. That meeting, subtle yet profound, had planted a seed of awareness that had grown into clarity, patience, and methodical action. Her calm certainty had mirrored the approach he himself would take with Victoria, deliberate, precise, and patient. By evening, he returned home to a quiet apartment, the city lights reflecting on wet streets from a light drizzle. Victoria was in the living room, reading quietly. Their interactions were measured, calm, no longer fraught with the invisible tension of past manipulations. Daniel realized the subtle liberation that comes not from victory, but from clarity, control, and the restoration of self. He picked up the dossier, placing it carefully in a secure drawer. The evidence was no longer a weapon. It was a testament to patience, observation, and deliberate action. He had used it not to punish, but to reclaim. Every detail, every document, every observation had contributed to the restoration of autonomy and clarity in his life. Later that night, he sat by the window, watching the city hum quietly beneath a blanket of light rain. His hands rested calmly on the windowsill, the faint reflection of streetlights mirrored in his eyes. He thought about the past, the small moments of quiet compliance, the subtle control that had weighed on him for decades. And he thought about the future, a life fully visible, deliberate, and wholly his own. For the first time in decades, Daniel allowed himself a deep, unhurried breath. The tension that had defined so many years, the constant anxiety, the quiet fear of subtle control was gone. In its place was clarity, autonomy, and a profound sense of personal agency. Victoria approached quietly, carrying a tray with tea. She placed it beside him without comment, her movement careful but unthreatening. Daniel acknowledged her presence with a simple nod, and for the first time, there was no unspoken power struggle, only the calm coexistence of two adults bound by mutual acknowledgement of boundaries. "You seem at peace," she said softly. "I am," he replied simply. "It took time, patience, observation, and deliberate action. But I'm here now, fully present and in control of my life." She nodded, a small, measured acknowledgement. She had seen the patient, methodical work, the careful cataloging of evidence, the precise assertion of autonomy. For the first time, she understood that dominance through subtle control was no longer possible, not because of confrontation, but because Daniel had claimed his clarity, his boundaries, and his life. Daniel smiled faintly, a quiet, deliberate acknowledgement of the journey. He had stepped fully into the light, leaving the shadows of compliance behind. The years of small manipulations, subtle control, and quiet intimidation had been dismantled, not with anger, but with precision, patience, and clarity. That night, he went to bed without tension, without lingering fear. The city hummed outside, soft and constant, like a rhythm he could finally trust. He closed his eyes, reflecting on the life he had reclaimed, the autonomy he had restored, and the profound liberation that comes from fully inhabiting one's own presence. In the quiet of the night, Daniel understood a final truth: the power of deliberate, patient, and precise action surpasses the fleeting impact of anger or confrontation. It restores not only agency, but the sense of self, the quiet dignity of being fully visible, fully aware, and fully in control. As he drifted into sleep, the rain pattered softly against the window, a steady rhythm marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Daniel Cross was no longer in the back, no longer subject to the subtle manipulations of others. He was awake, aware, and finally living his life fully visible, deliberate, and wholly his own. The city outside continued to hum, indifferent yet constant, mirroring the quiet confidence he had built within himself. For the first time, Daniel felt the profound satisfaction of a life reclaimed, not through confrontation, not through anger, but through clarity, patience, and precise action. He had finally achieved the freedom he had long been denied, and in that quiet, deliberate peace, Daniel knew he would never return to the shadows. If you like history, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.